you so much for coming to my taster lecture today. My name is Sarah Cullinan Herring. I teach Latin and Ancient Greek at the Classics faculty and Greek literature at Wadham College. I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the texts that you would study if you came here to study the Classics undergraduate degree here at Oxford. That'll be the Iliad and Euripides' Bacchae, and also about some texts which not all students would study, so it would depend whether you picked certain special subject papers or whether you maybe stayed on to do some graduate work, so some more unusual texts. At Oxford, we work in really small groups, and one or two students will work on the set text with their tutor and discuss issues within those texts and write an essay each week. And because of that, our students are part of our research from the very beginning of our ideas, from the very beginning of our books and our articles, and that's actually what I'm sharing with you today. So I'm going to share an idea that I had when I was teaching my graduates this term about masculinity in these Greek texts. So we're going to have a look at how these texts depict different sorts of masculinity and what that might tell us about ancient Greek attitudes to gender roles. So what makes a man? It's quite a big question, I know. So if you think about the Greek statues that you can see on the slide in front of you, and you might have seen things like this if you've been to Greece or been to any museums with Greek objects in them, I think you'll probably agree with me that the Greek world was quite obvious in its presentation of what it means to be a man in terms of the physicality of it, and that historically the Greek world was very much controlled by men, exercising what seems to be a very clear example of hegemonic masculinity to reinforce their control over women and over other groups of non-hegemonic men. So that might include enslaved men and non-Greek men. The term hegemonic masculinity was coined by an American sociologist called Rywin Connell in her 1995 book Masculinities, and she used that to refer to the use of masculinity by elite groups to safeguard their own power within society and to sort of subjugate other groups within society that don't fulfill those gender roles. I think we should probably narrow down what we might mean by hegemonic masculinity in terms of ancient Greece. And I think we've started with this physical manifestation. So if we think of Greek statues of men, the body type is very clear. So you've got this muscled, athletic body type, very strong, an emphasis on physical prowess and physical ability. And that actually ties into wider Greek cultural perceptions of what it meant to be a man. So male pursuits for the elite included not only warfare, which of course would have excluded women, but also hunting and athletics. So the Greeks had several regular pan-Hellenic games where men would gather and compete in different sporting activities, and non-men were excluded. So women were excluded from those games, and so were enslaved men and non-Greek men. So it was very much about reinforcing not just masculinity, but a very particular type of masculinity for the elite. And it's pretty clear when we look at the texts that are on the undergraduate syllabus that men in literature are praised for engaging successfully in these hegemonically masculine pursuits of physical endeavour, and they're criticised if they fail to do this. So let's have a look at an example of this. So on this slide, you can see a little passage from Homer's Iliad. So that's one of the earliest Greek texts that we have surviving to us. It's at the heart of our undergraduate syllabus in the first year and a half. Everyone studies it, even if you don't have Greek when you come. We think it was written down probably around 650 BC. But it represents a society going back much further than that, so probably around 1200 BC. And you probably know, some of you, the story of the Iliad. It's telling the story of the Trojan War. Paris, the Trojan prince, has gone to Greece and stayed as a guest at Menelaus, the king of Sparta's house, and he falls in love with Helen, Menelaus's wife, and decides to make off with her. And so Helen and Paris run off, taking lots of treasure. And this is the cause of the Trojan War. So here we can see Menelaus and Paris about to have a duel. And this was a scene set actually quite far into the Trojan War, but at this point, the two sides decide it might be a good idea for the the two men who are most closely involved to fight it out 1-to-1, and that would end the need for the war and all this death if the winner could just take Helen, and that would settle the matter. So you can see this here. And note how the two men are described. So Menelaus, the wronged husband, is compared to a lion, so a very strong animal, and he is preying on, in this simile, weaker animals. So that's not a coincidence, of course, goat or a stag. And then we also get this element of the hunt, and that again is not a coincidence. So we're already in a hegemonically masculine arena. We're already on the battlefield, but we have brought in here the hunt. So we get the mention of nimble hounds and powerful huntsmen. So Menelaus is essentially a hegemonic masculine figure. So he's a success on the battlefield. He's like a lion. He's like a successful huntsman, and he's not a bit scared of this situation. You can see he's really keen to throttle Paris and get revenge on him for stealing his wife. So he's leaping down from his chariot in full armor. And then we've got Paris. So Paris here is depicted, and you can see I've underlined the key moments here in this passage. So he's sick at heart, and he's compared to a man who sees a snake and is afraid and kind of runs away from the snake. So he's trembling in every limb. He's retreating with a pallid face. And here we have Paris fearing Menelaus, running away essentially and hiding himself among the throng of Trojan warriors. So two very different reactions to this masculine pursuit of the duel. And we can see then in the next slide, Hector, Paris's brother, his reaction to this. So he goes to find Paris as he's hiding. And this is where it really starts to get interesting. So Hector here, furious with Paris for his behavior, but look at what he says to him. He links Paris's beauty and his physical characteristics to his lack of courage on the battlefield. So Paris is beautiful to look on. He's a seducer and deceiver of women, and this causes him to be an object of men's contempt. So we can see other men criticize and look down on Paris because he's beautiful and because he's this kind of seducer of women. And then Hector imagines that their opponents, the Greeks, must be laughing at the Trojans because their champion in the duel that they've sent forward is just a pretty face, essentially. He's beautiful, but he's devoid of strength and courage. And so you can see in that underlined passage in the middle there, so he was chosen only for his beauty, devoid of strength and courage, that for Hector, beauty seems to be mutually exclusive with being strong and courageous on the battlefield, that you can't be both. And he again links Paris's beauty to something that we might more expect from a female character in one of these poems. So he's got gifts from Aphrodite, who's the female goddess of love and desire, good looks and flowing locks. So Paris doesn't present himself in terms of his appearance like the other hegemonic males in this poem, and Hector himself is the ultimate example on the Trojan side of a successful hegemonic character. He's amazing on the battlefield, he's very strong, he's married to a respectable woman, unlike Helen, who has produced a son, and so he's kind of the perfect hegemonic male who stands up for his community and goes to fight on the battlefield, and he's criticizing Paris then for kind of failing to live up to that. But what's really, really interesting is that it's not all negative. So you might think, oh, well, this is a very straightforward scenario where, hegemonic masculinity is praised, and what we might call hybrid masculinity, where Paris is kind of combining some of the feminine traits with masculine traits. It's not as simple as saying that one is better than the other, because as we see, Paris is very successful in terms of attracting women and his impact on the opposite sex. So here we have Helen talking to Priam, king of Troy, as they prepare to watch this duel between Paris and her ex-husband. And she makes it very clear that she chose to leave the hegemonic male, the successful king, the mighty warrior Menelaus, for Paris. So she says, I wish I had chosen death rather than following your son, leaving behind my bridal chamber, my daughter, and so on. Now, she obviously regrets it now because of the war and because of everything that has happened, but she doesn't claim that she was forced to leave. She doesn't claim that Aphrodite sort of dragged her kicking and screaming, which is a version that we hear in other different texts. She makes it clear that she chose to follow him, that she was attracted by him. And you can see this even more strongly at the end of this book of the Iliad. So bearing in mind that at this point in the poem, Paris has lost the duel with Menelaus in public. So he's been humiliated, essentially, in front of all the Greeks and the Trojans. And you might think that at this point, Helen would say, look, you know, I really wish I was with Menelaus and you're a failure. And I can't believe that, you know, you lost that duel. But in fact, she still desires him as much as always. And the poet makes that really clear by ending this book of the poem with this scene. So we see Paris here successfully sort of seducing Helen and taking her to bed, and the painting on the other half of the slide you can see is inspired by that. So you can see the goddess Aphrodite flying off, and she symbolizes their love, and they're about to sort of go to bed together after this duel. So Paris is a figure with a lot of conflict. So on the one hand, he fails on the battlefield, and he's not someone who's successful as in that hegemonically masculine world. But on the other hand, he has this devastating impact on women, particularly Helen, who is, of course, the most beautiful woman in the world. So he is a success in that sense, and that tension is something that we will see occurring again in these texts. So let's just move to have a look at Euripides' Bacchae. So in the Bacchae, we have a story of Dionysus coming from the east and bringing his new cult, the cult of Dionysus, to Greece. He does that in disguise, so he disguises himself as a young man from Lydia. And what's interesting about these passages from the Bacchae is how this young man from Lydia, who is really Dionysus in disguise, is described by the other hegemonically masculine characters. In the disguise, Dionysus manages to charm all of the women of Thebes to follow the cult of Dionysus, which involves putting on fawn skins and ivy garlands and carrying a special staff and going off into the wilderness to worship Dionysus, sort of leaving behind their homes and their children. And so that effect that he has on women is something that is a really important part of his presentation. And you can see here that the young, suspicious king Pentheus, who has no time for this at all, he thinks this new cult is deeply suspicious. He focuses in on the fact that the appearance of this stranger, again, has this hybrid characteristic. So he is a young man, but his appearance looks in some ways very feminine. So he's got sweet smelling hair in golden ringlets, and he's got Aphrodite's charms in his wine dark eyes. So again, that mention of Aphrodite coming back in. So Pentheus is criticizing this stranger for presenting himself in a non-traditionally masculine way, but he is also very clearly afraid of the effect that this stranger will have on the women. So he says he hangs around the girls day and night, luring him in with his joyful mysteries. So again, that's looking very much like Paris. And you can see then later in the play, Pentheus decides he's going to have to do something about this. He's going to have to stop this guy corrupting all of the women. So he tells some people to go and arrest the stranger. You can see here he says to go to the city, scour it, to capture this effeminate stranger who corrupts our women with a new disease and thus infects our beds. The word effeminate, I've underlined it there, is not a perfect real translation really for that Greek word that is in bold. And I know not all of you will have Greek, but I thought it would be nice for you just to see a bit of it, you know, and see what kinds of things you'll be dealing with. But the Greek word is thelumorphon, and that word is a compound word with two elements. So the first half, the thelu, that has resonances of feminine and female. And then the morphon bit at the end, as you might think from English, has something to do with shape or form. And so perhaps a better translation, although it's a bit clunky, might be this female shaped stranger, or this female formed or female looking stranger. So you can see that this is to do with Dionysus's physical appearance and not to do with his character or his behavior necessarily. It's very much to do with his physical appearance and the effect that has on the women. And I think that's very important to note, because again, with Paris, it was his physical beauty that was seen as incompatible with bravery. So it's all to do with the kind of the appearance of these characters and how they are rejecting the usual physical appearance of a man. Okay, so we can have a look then at the last passage from the Bacchae I was going to share with you today, where we see Pentheus speaking directly to Dionysus, to this stranger. And you can see that, again, the themes are becoming very clear. So he has long hair, he has white skin from careful preparation. This refers to the fact that Greek women would be expected to stay inside. They wouldn't be engaging in those outdoor male activities of sport or warfare or farming. And so their skin would be white. So you'll see that on Greek vases and in other visual representations of women from the ancient world. So their skin will be depicted as being very pale, and men will be depicted with darker tan skin. So the fact that the stranger has a white skin, immediately to an ancient Greek eye, that would mark him out as looking feminine. And of course, Pentheus again denies this stranger Dionysus the kind of male pursuit of sport. So he says, you don't look like someone who can wrestle, so not through wrestling. You don't do sport like a man. Instead, you sort of prepare your skin and lounge around in this shade. I think you probably see that Pentheus might be criticizing Dionysus here, but he clearly quite likes the way he looks. So there's a bit of fascination here too. So he says, your body is not ill-formed, stranger, for women's purposes. So he clearly likes what he sees, and I think that's important too. So there might be criticism and there might be suspicion and even a little bit of fear, but there is also a fascination and an attraction there, and we'll come back to that again when we draw all this together at the end. Okay, so let's have a look at Adonis. So here you've just got a modern painting of Venus is just the Roman name for Aphrodite. So you'll see them used interchangeably often in modern texts and modern art. So you see here a painting that sums up the story of who Adonis was. So that's why I've included it. So he was a young man who Aphrodite fell in love with. So he's the most beautiful human on Earth, and she falls in love with him. And she actually gets into a bit of a battle with Persephone, the queen of the underworld, who also falls in love with him. And they go to Zeus to ask, well, who can have Adonis? And Zeus has to decide which of these two goddesses can have Adonis. And poor Adonis doesn't seem to be given much choice at all. He's kind of being pulled in between the two goddesses. And Zeus decides that Adonis should spend a third of the year in the underworld with Persephone, a third of the year with Aphrodite, and then a third of the year on his own, doing what he likes. But by this point, Adonis has fallen in love with Aphrodite, which isn't a surprise, of course, because Aphrodite is the goddess of love and beauty, and he decides to give his third of the year to Aphrodite. So we've got this couple then, and he adores Aphrodite, and they form this kind of ideal couple. And all is going beautifully until Adonis decides to go and try to participate in a hunt to kill a wild boar, and unfortunately he's not successful in that hunt. The boar gores him in the thigh and he dies. And so there's lots of ancient art and literature depicting first their perfect relationship, so it's depicted as this idyllic, very perfect relationship of true love and passion, and then the tragic death. And we get lots of images of Aphrodite kind of lamenting over his body and weeping. So the last text we're going to look at is a text really that you wouldn't come across unless you picked a special paper. So it's a less studied text, but really, really interesting. So it's by a poet called Bion. We know almost nothing about him. We don't know really exactly when he was writing or much about his life. And he wrote this poem, Lament for Adonis, which just centers on Adonis's death and the tragedy of the sort of love affair being ended by his tragic death so young. And I want you to notice in these texts again, the same themes coming up. So Adonis is described with the physical characteristics that you might expect from a female character. So he's got a white thigh, he's got snow white flesh, he's got rosy pink lips. The rosy hue flees from his lips. So again, this description is something that links back to Paris, links to Dionysus, but very much makes us think Adonis is not hegemonically masculine character, which is interesting given that he is loved by the goddess of love and beauty and desire, who could have anyone she wanted, and she's obsessed with this young man who really isn't hegemonically masculine and has this kind of hybrid masculinity. The other thing that's interesting about this poem and the way that it depicts Adonis is that the poet seems to move around in his language between whether Adonis is a boy or a man. So here I've given you just a selection of quotations from the poem which show this slippage in language. So we hear that Adonis has a cruel wound in his thigh. Greater is the wound that Aphrodite has in her heart around that boy, and the Greek word there is paida, and it really does mean child or boy. His own hunting dogs howl and the mountain nymphs weep. But then just a few lines later, so you can see the line numbers given here, so just 10 lines later, the poet says, woe for Cytherea, that's just another name for Aphrodite, woe for Cytherea, wail the loves in answer, she has lost her handsome husband, and the Greek word there is andra, and with him she has lost her holy beauty. And then again later, Aphrodite speaks in the poem to Persephone, her rival in love for Adonis, and says, take my husband, Posin, that's the Greek word, you are much greater than I, Persephone. So we have across this poem, sometimes the poet uses the word for boy and sometimes the word for husband or man. And really you shouldn't really be able to be a pais, a boy, and an aner, a man at the same time. So this is kind of showing a tension within Adonis's character, which I think is reflective of his hybrid masculinity. So not only is he not physically hegemonically masculine, but has these kind of feminine characteristics, he's also on the boundary between being a man and a boy. So he's probably about 18 or 19, and he hasn't quite come into full manhood yet. And the poet's really exploring that tension. So again, if we have a look at this central portion of the poem, this problem becomes really obvious here. So we see Aphrodite is grieving, she's wandering through the thickets, weeping, and I've underlined the key passage. So wailing loudly, she moves through the long glens, crying out for her Assyrian boy and calling him many times. But around his navel was floating dark blood, and his chest grew red with blood from his thighs, and Adonis's breasts, once snow white, grew dark. So there are two things I want to draw to your attention here. Firstly, this reference to Adonis being her Assyrian boy. Editors of this poem and commentators have been so troubled by the use of the word boy, which is again pais, this word for child, here, that they've changed it to husband. They've actually amended the text because they feel so uncomfortable that Aphrodite is grieving for someone who could be called a boy or a child, while at the same time, obviously, this is a sexual relationship, a passionate relationship. But I think, I hope that the examples I showed you before make clear that this is actually something this poem is interested in, and something that this poem is kind of dwelling on is he a boy or a man, and is that transition between boyhood and manhood wrapped up in whether he is hegemonically masculine or not, and he clearly isn't. So he's a hybrid. He's got this hybrid masculinity, and he's also on a liminal point between boyhood and manhood. So I would argue that it's really important that we leave the original text there, which is pais, boy. So she is crying out for her Assyrian boy. The second problem here, which is sort of the last thing really that we'll look at, is this reference to Adonis's breasts. So again, this is really this word madzdoi in Greek is for breast. It's really something that you would use of a woman, and particularly something you would use of women in a maternal context. So it's not a word like chest, where you might think, oh well, it can be used of anyone. And so it seems to be, if the reading is correct, really reinforcing how ambiguous Adonis is in terms of his gender. So his skin is so white and his chest is so kind of soft and unmuscled that he almost does have the kind of breast or the chest you would expect from a feminine character rather than from a masculine character. And so that would really reinforce our view of him as being this kind of hybrid masculinity. There is another suggestion, though, which would require a little textual emendation, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but you have to trust me that it's possible that actually the text here refers to Aphrodite's breasts, and that what's happening is she's holding Adonis to her chest as he dies, and that her chest becomes bloodied with his blood. And it would only be a very small change the text, and it would actually fit with what we know about this scene, this very famous scene when Aphrodite's kind of, lamenting over her lover from other poems. So we can see here in Theocritus's poem, this exact scene is described. So did not Adonis drive fair Cytherea to such frenzy that she holds him to her breast even in death? And there are lots of images of this in both ancient and modern art. It was a very powerful image, which seems to have really captured the imagination of artists. So I wonder whether what's going on here is actually that it's Aphrodite who's holding Adonis. But I think in either case, it shows us that he's not a typical hegemonic man, because either he is being depicted as having this very sort of soft white chest, which is something more feminine, or he's being depicted as a sort of boy on the cusp of manhood being clasped to quite a maternal breast. So the power dynamic in the relationship is very much one where Aphrodite is the kind of the more powerful one, and that maternal blurring seems to sort of reflect that. Okay, so last thoughts then on this interesting figure is that when Aphrodite addresses her dead husband, she really echoes some of the things that Hector said all the way back at the beginning of the talk on Paris and his failure on the battlefield. So she addresses her dead lover and she says, "Why did you rashly go hunting? You're so beautiful. Why were you so mad as to struggle with a wild beast?" So you can see here exactly as Hector thought Paris wasn't really capable on the battlefield because he was just too beautiful, he was too good looking. So Aphrodite seems to think that Adonis, it was obvious that he couldn't hunt a wild boar because he's too beautiful, and it was always kind of doomed to end in disaster. So you can see that those themes seem to be coming back in this story. So what are we to make of all of this? In all three cases, Paris, Dionysus, and Adonis, we have examples of male characters whose physical presentation includes features which would usually be associated with another gender. In this case, they are all visual cues which, to an ancient Greek, would signal a feminine characteristic. And these characters also all have a very powerful attraction for the female characters in each text. So Paris attracts Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. Dionysus attracts all of the women of Thebes, and Adonis captivates not only the goddess of love and beauty herself, Aphrodite, but also the queen of the underworld. So he's got two goddesses in love with him. In the Iliad and in the Bacchae, we see that the more traditionally or hegemonically masculine characters criticize these examples of hybrid masculinity, and there's clearly a real deep sense of unease on the part of the traditionally masculine characters surrounding people who don't conform to those gender stereotypes, and a fear for what effects that refusal to conform might have on the society that they live in. In the earlier texts, we saw that the effect on the communities surrounding these gender ambiguous characters is manifestly negative. So for Paris, his relationship with Helen and the powerful sexual attraction he has for Helen results in the destruction of his whole community and the death of his brothers, the death of his parents, the enslavement of his female family members. In Thebes, Dionysus wreaks havoc on the city and the royal family, punishing Pentheus for his lack of belief in the new god, and manages to drive the women of the family to murder their own son brutally as his punishment for refusing to believe. By the time we get to Adonis, the negative effects seem to be a little bit less dramatic. So they are not community-wide, but they're just confined to Adonis himself, who obviously tragically dies as he fails to compete on the hegemonically masculine hunting ground. So there seems to be an equal amount of fascination and fear on the part of male authors of these texts in their exploration of these gender roles and the consequences which might occur if people don't conform to the roles expected of them. Their fear seems to be that hegemonic masculinity in the end doesn't hold all the cards, because although they might hold the physical prowess on the battlefield or on the hunting ground, they might hold political power. Who really holds the power if it's the people with hybrid characteristics who are able to charm and persuade and fascinate women and have these kind of really powerful effects on the wider community. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully take some questions. So please do share any questions that you have in the live event Q&A.
We've got a couple of questions that have come through already, Sarah. Do you want to read them out yourself, or would you like me to read them for you?
Yeah, I can. I'm not seeing them, so if you wouldn't mind reading them, that'd be great.
How would the dangerous nature of this beauty relate to the idea of a femme fatale today?
That's really interesting, actually. I think whoever asked that question's really put their finger on a theme that runs right down into modern society, which is a fear of sexuality and a fear of sexual power. And the difference really lies in the fact that in the ancient Greek context, because these texts are authored by men, male authors, and really often for a male audience, they don't actually think too much about female sexuality, or less at least, and so the fear is expressed in a kind of alternative male sexuality. But I think it's very much a similar fear, which is, you know, what happens when someone has such a huge amount of sexual power that it kind of enables them to break social boundaries, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, thanks, Sarah. Another question, would it be possible to say as well that Adonis is also on the cusp of masculinity and femininity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Like, I think Adonis stands right on that boundary, which raises a really interesting question about how these male authors are actually interested in female sexuality. So obviously they are they're male authors writing for a male audience, but they want to show what women like or what women want, and it seems to be that, you know, that they're at least afraid or intrigued by the idea that women don't want them, or they don't want someone who's kind of traditionally masculine, but they might want someone who's more similar to themselves, or where there's some kind of common ground. I'm just seeing some really interesting questions popping up. So,
oh, brilliant! If you can see them, I'll leave you to pick the ones that you're loving, and I'll just publish them all as they come through. Thanks.
Absolutely. Sarah. So I've got how do these notions of fearful masculinity impact current society, such as the outcry over femme boys, for instance, and Harry Styles wearing a dress? I think it's exactly the same thing. I think, you know, that's one of the reasons this topic really interested me, was that I feel like there is a lot of fear in our society too about surrounding people, and suspicion surrounding people who don't want to conform to what we might see as traditional gender roles. And I think that there's a lot that the ancient texts can teach us about attitudes to gender roles, and how, you know, we might kind of open things up a little bit. Someone's asked, would the depiction of Adonis in ancient society be looked down upon? Well, that's really the nub of what I was talking about, in a way, because in one way, yes, so we see people criticize, we see that even within the ancient texts, you know, male characters criticizing these men, but then on the other hand, you know, Adonis has Aphrodite, the goddess of love, kind of chasing after him. And, you know, we have another text which I had included, but we didn't have time to look at, where the poet depicts two women, normal women, going to see a festival of Adonis, and these two ordinary women say, oh, he's so beautiful and he's just absolutely perfect, and isn't Aphrodite so lucky? And they kind of go on and on about how gorgeous he is and how lucky Aphrodite is to be with him, and at the same time they complain about their husbands being kind of grumpy and, you know, not kind of what they want in life. So I think, you know, there is that tension in the text about, you know, are we supposed to approve of Adonis or not? It's not really clear. So Neve has said, would you say that this shows a fear of femininity within their culture? Are there examples of a feminine male with no negative connotations in their story? This is a really, really interesting question. I cannot think of any examples where there are no negative connotations. Okay, so I think that's really comes to the heart of it, Neve. Absolutely right. And I think it is a fear of femininity, and there are other examples, which again I didn't include, of women stepping outside their gender roles, and that always has negative connotations as well. Would it be plausible to say that in some regards the Romans and Greeks were more open about male sexuality than people today? I'm not sure if this questioner means male sexuality or kind of a homosexual kind of sexuality. I think if it is the latter, so if we're talking about kind of male same-sex relationships, then yes, because those in ancient Greece, there was a context for same-sex relationships, which was part of, should we say, the kind of the norm or the sort of traditional way a man might grow up and might live. And I think that was, although there were certain boundaries around it, so it wasn't quite the same as same-sex relationships today. So there was no such thing as same-sex marriage, for instance, or being able to live in a long-term same-sex relationship. But same-sex sexual desire was certainly something that was recognised as sort of normal part of life and a normal part of growing up. All questions are going so quickly. Keep losing them, seeing them, thinking it was so interesting. Do you think the contempt and fascination shown by more manly men could be interpreted as envy? Yes, absolutely. So I think this is the whole thing. So there's a critical element, but there is also very clearly a kind of a jealousy or a fear, a kind of insecurity, if you like, there. Absolutely. How set were the specific gender roles in ancient society when the concept of gender is more blurred and less rigid than in modern society? That's a really interesting question. So it was in ancient Greece. Let's just take Greece and let's take Athens as our example, because obviously it could be quite a big question. Gender roles were extremely rigidly policed and prescribed. So there was a kind of very narrow range of things that women could do. So women were not politically active. They weren't citizens. They couldn't vote. They couldn't take part in any kind of voting or political role at all. And they weren't even legally sort of entities in their own right. So women were minors, legal minors their whole lives. So either their father was in charge of them or their husband, or if they didn't have a husband, another male in their family. So their role was essentially to get married and have children. That was all women were for, and all women could really do. They had a small religious potential for influence in religious matters, because some particular aspects of religion might need a priestess, but apart from that, really, that was it. So the gender roles were much more rigidly divided than they are today. Okay, I'll maybe take one more question and then we can hand over to my colleague who is going to be doing the next taster lecture. So to what extent do you think the beauty of the men represents the female gaze and how their vanity is reflected through their attraction towards feminine men? That's so interesting. I think that we have to be a bit careful, because the authors of these texts are all men, and we don't really have any women's voices apart from Sappho. We have very few female voices talking about what they want or what they desired, or female sexuality from women's point of view. So we have to be a bit careful saying that this is what women wanted, but what we can say is that this is what the male authors thought women wanted or feared that women wanted. And so if we could see a vanity there, that might reflect more a male attitude towards women, so that the male authors think that women are vain and kind of, you know, interested in their appearance, and that perhaps reflects back on what they want in that way. So yeah, anyway, guys, thank you so much. Such amazing questions. I'm really sorry that I couldn't answer more of them, but if you want to ask me any more questions, you could always ask again on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter. I put it up on the start of the talk, so you can catch me there if you want to ask anything, if you didn't get a chance or I didn't get a chance to answer your question. My colleague Roel is giving the next lecture entitled "Stick Them with the Pointy End, Amateurism in Greek Warfare." Sounds fascinating. So if you head over to that, I think the link will be published in the chat.
Yeah, it's just there now, Sarah.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you
okay.
so much. I loved your lecture. It was so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your day.